Close to on time, so why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. Um, my name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. For those of you that are cooperators, I hope you're getting out on your land and checking things out. This has been an amazing spring. For those of you new to Coverts, we are a statewide nonprofit that works with landowners on managing woodlands for wildlife and provide educational opportunities. And we've moved this whole program online for right now. So that's been really interesting, and we've had some great topics and connections with everybody. For these kinds of programs, we ask that you please mute yourselves so we don't have the background noise, and you open the chat box, and if you have any questions, that you type those into the chat box. And Kim also likes to do a bit of an interactive program, so she may ask a few questions. So you can type your answers in the chat box, and I'll share them with Kim, and we'll talk a little bit about the answers that you might provide to those as well. Today we have Kim Royar from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, who's joining us, and will share with us about the history of wildlife and wildlife management here in Vermont. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about herself, and she can begin her program. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Well, I know I recognize a lot of the names here, so I know that I've met a lot of you already, and some of you may have actually heard this presentation if you're Coverts members, but so I apologize for that. But my name is Kim Royar, as Lisa said. I've worked for the department since 1981. Started out as a habitat biologist, became the fur bearer biologist, did that for about 20 years, went to the central office and worked for the commissioner for about 6 years, and then came back to the fur bearer project position. So it's been a relatively long career so far, but I still get a kick out of it, so I'm still doing it. So anyway, I will start this. If, like Lisa said, if you have questions, let's keep it pretty informal. It's not a huge group. You can type in a chat, and you can interrupt me, Lisa, if you want, okay? I may try the interactive thing. We'll see how it works. It's kind of the way I do these talks, but we'll see how it goes. If it doesn't work, we'll continue on, and you can ask questions at the end. All right, so let me see if I can share my screen here. And there we go. Can everybody see that? Looks like you can see it, right, Lisa? Okay.
Yep.
So let me just. Okay. So those of you who have seen this before, you know I usually start quite a ways back, probably about 2,000 years ago, about the time that Jesus walked the streets of Palestine. And in the Northeast here, we had a Native American culture that was, by necessity, lived fairly lightly on the land. They moved around a lot. They weren't very tied to agricultural back then. They were hunters and gatherers, and so they could only really take what they could carry. They used all sorts of wildlife for food and clothing. Beaver were of particular importance just because they were very tasty, and they provided excellent warm garments for Native Americans at the time. The forest at the time didn't look very different than it looks in Vermont today. It was about 90 to 95% forest, much higher composition of beech with some hemlock and spruce and maple mixed in. Many of the same wildlife species were here at the time, although some of the larger predators that have now been extirpated from Vermont were here back then. And whoops, I guess I might. But what's interesting is that many people who have studied the forest, historical forest and the present forest, said it's sort of a paradox. The forest historically, what looked a lot like it does today, it was probably a lot more older forest, but you know, the forest is not a carbon copy of what it was historically. And many of the components and processes that existed back then have been diminished. So the landscape mosaic and patterns are pretty different now than what they were then. And one of the reasons for that is that we lost one of the ecosystem engineers that we don't really think about very much, and that's the passenger pigeon. it's really hard to overstate the role that the passenger pigeon played in patch dynamics of the historical forest. And they used to exist in megaflocks of billions of birds, if you can imagine that. And they would scatter across the Northeast and create a forest disturbance that Audubon actually equated to a combination of a forest fire and a tornado. So you can imagine if one of those flocks actually ended up in your woodlot. I'm not sure that we would tolerate that today, because you can imagine hundreds of thousands of birds. The weight of those birds would break the branches of your trees. The guano created huge openings in the forest. But back historically, that was one of the ways that patches in the forest were created. Now, across the ocean, the attitudes towards wildlife was pretty different, and the way they utilized wildlife was pretty different. So Viking traders actually would collect things like beavers, sables, squirrels, and use them as a monetary exchange. They would exchange furs from these animals for things that they needed, like wheat, honey, wine, and cloth. So wildlife had a monetary value. People were more sedentary. They could stockpile these animals, these furs, and actually take more than probably what was sustainable at the time. Beaver were always in demand, probably most highly in demand. Anybody know why? It's the first bullet says fur uniquely suited to felting. Anybody know what that felting was used for? Anybody guessing, Lisa?
Not yet.
Okay. I can give you.
We got one. Oh,
Okay.
A couple put in hats.
That's right, yes. So the underfur of the beaver had these minute little barbs that, when pressed together and gone through a certain type of processing, create what's a beaver felt hat. And in Europe at the time, almost all the hats that were worn were some kind of beaver felt hat. And so this was a really important clothing item for people, an important business for many people back then. And so this beaver were actually harvested to use the underfur to create these hats. Plus, they would utilize many parts of the beaver. They would eat the animal. The tail, because it was scaled, they actually considered it something they could eat during Lent, like fish, in exchange for fish. I mean, the tail is primarily all fat, but people used to eat it. And I also understand that Canadians used to eat the tail of beaver as well. And they were relatively easy to catch back then. So by the mid-1500s, this is hard to believe because the European population was not all that large at the time, but by the mid-1500s, the unregulated taking of fur bearers left only the remote reaches of Siberia and Scandinavia with abundant beaver populations. And you think that would have raised a red flag for many of the folks, and they might have said, maybe we better start to set some regulations. They didn't. They just went further into Russia and Siberia and kept going. So that by the end of the 13th century, you know, many people were utilizing furs. And you can think about how people lived back then. Whether you lived in a castle or in a thatched hut, it was chilly up in Northern Europe and downright cold in the wintertime. And furs were a way that people stayed warm. They used furs for rugs, they used furs for blankets, they used furs for curtains, and they used furs for clothing. And in particular, the wealthy people would stockpile fur garments, and kings and dukes would own as many as 20 to 30 garments each. Just to give you an idea, the volume from 1285 to 1288, this one King Edward I bought 120,000 squirrel pelts in 1 year. So that completely unregulated taking of fur, like I said, extirpated most of the European fur-bearing species by the end of the 1300s, which is pretty shocking. Something happened in the nick of time that actually saved the hat trade. And rather than ask you, I will tell you. they discovered North America. And to them, this was like an unlimited supply of resources. I mean, they came over here primarily for fur, and it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the fur trade to the discovery of many parts of North America and the establishment of different settlements in North America. Many of our cities in the East Coast were established as fur trade centers. I apologize for the phone ringing. Just hang it up. We were supposed to take it off the hook. So the Europeans came over and met that same Native American population that had been here for 2,000 years. And these folks were still living in the Stone Age. Can you just hang it up? Here, give me the phone.
You gotta love technology, right?
Oh, sorry, you guys.
I'll bear with you for a moment.
We have so many
Kim.
phones in the house that, okay. So I'm just gonna take this off the hook if I can.
This is a commercial interlude, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, well. All right. That's old technology and I still can't make it work. Anyway, I apologize. Anyway, the Native Americans that were here had not progressed very far from where they had been for the previous 2,000 years. They still lived primarily in the Stone Age. Their tools were made out of bones from animals or stones. They were still wearing clothing that were from animals and eating animals. And here come these Europeans who offer to trade them a gun or cloth or an iron tool for a beaver pelt. And I'll just read you a quick paragraph out of Alice Outwater's book, Water, just to give you an idea of what the Native Americans originally thought. At the onset of the fur trade, 10 good beavers, adult winter prime northern hides that were stretched and cured, bought the Indians one gun. One good beaver bought variously 1/2 pound of powder, 4 pounds of shot, a hatchet, 8 jackknives, 1/2 pound of beads, a good coat, or a pound of tobacco. The beaver does everything perfectly well, an Indian trapper told the Jesuit priest in 1657. It makes kettles, hatchets, swords, knives, bread. In short, it makes everything. The English have no sense. They give us 2 knives for 1 beaver skin. So at first, this seemed like just an amazing thing to these natives. And then eventually, as you all know, the history of what happened here, the Europeans brought disease. The natives became more and more dependent on the fur trade because so many of their villages were decimated by disease. They could no longer farm very well. And so what's amazing is that by the mid-1670s, and keep this in mind, nearly 250,000 beaver had been shipped to London from the Connecticut River Valley alone, and beaver had become scarce in the area. So probably almost 100 years before Vermont was settled, beaver had almost been eliminated from much of the Connecticut River Valley, which is pretty amazing. Again, the search for beaver drove the exploration of this new world. The wagon trains that went west followed the trails that had been laid out by the fur trappers that had gone before them. And by the time most of those early settlers had gone west, beaver had actually been extirpated from many of the habitats in the West. And so by the time that the wagon train went west on the Oregon Trail in 1843, beaver were essentially gone. And that's hard to believe when you consider the ability for beaver populations to grow. And this is a schematic and it doesn't include mortality, but you'll see later how a population can grow this quickly. If you have a family of 6 beaver, potentially in 10 years, you can have 600 beaver. So it's hard to believe that an animal that can repopulate this quickly could actually be extirpated in that period of time, but it basically happened. And what happens is beaver, this is just assume that this little red dot is a beaver family group. So 2 adults, maybe 2 young of the year, and then two 2-year-olds, and then maybe 4 or 6 kits. And at 2 years old, those beaver get kicked out of the lodge, and they go up or downstream a half a mile or so and create new lodges and new dams, and then they kick their 2-year-olds out and spreads across the landscape till eventually the whole habitat is saturated. And there's some estimates that historically we might have had as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in good beaver habitat. And when you think about that, a square mile is about 640 acres. If each one of those dams is holding about an acre of water back, you're talking about half of that square mile is in some form of beaver influenced wetland. So beaver had an amazing impact on the forests of historical forests. And so it's another form of patch dynamics that was occurring prior to European settlement. So between beaver and passenger pigeons, there was quite a bit of disturbance going on in those historic forests that don't occur as much today. So we consider beaver a keystone species. It's an animal that creates habitat for many, many other animals. A family of beaver can build a dam that's 35 feet long in about a week. So they are industrious little animals, as we all know. They create these beautiful wetlands and beautiful ponds that provide habitat for a whole host of other species. We've all seen them, any of us that have spent any time in a beaver wetland. We've seen the great blue herons. We've seen a variety of waterfowl. Some studies have shown 92 different songbird species associated with beaver wetlands. The dead and dying trees create holes for things like pileated woodpeckers and heron nests. So it's just an amazing habitat. There's many other mammals that are associated with it, things like muskrat, moose. So when beaver were extirpated from the Northeast, we assume, and we've documented some of these, but many of those we weren't really monitoring way back in the 1600s, as you can imagine. We can assume that many of the species associated with these wetlands probably declined. And we know that some of them, like otter and moose and black bear and others, did decline, probably as a result of the loss of beavers, at least in part. So what's interesting is when you think about, when I mentioned that beaver were probably gone from the Vermont landscape, or at least really limited in numbers by the early or late 1600s, European settlers didn't really enter Vermont until about the late 1700s. And in 1760, we had only about 3,000 European settlers. And when they settled Vermont really differently than southern New England. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, the first settlers that came over from Europe sort of settled in communities, and they had village greens, and they had a church, and their houses were built around the village green, and they would walk to their fields or turn their livestock out in the village green. When people came up and settled Vermont, they came in family groups, and they created these little subsistence farms and carved 100 acres out of the wilderness. So we had 3,000 European settlers in about 1760. By 1790, that had jumped to 85,000, and by 1800, we had 155,000 European settlers. This was called the surge, and each one of those family groups were carving out openings in the forest. And eventually, as most of you probably know the history, by 1800, we'd gone from about 90 to 95% forest to 75%. By the mid-1800s or late 1800s, we were down to 30% forest. And all of that was due to the clearing of the forest, primarily for potash and for sheep farming. Now, the attitudes that these settlers had towards wildlife was also very European. Most of them needed to protect that livestock. That was their livelihood. And so any predator was a threat to that livelihood. And this was the case of, you'll see the map on the right, the red dots are indications of where wolves had been shot between 1777 and 1781. And this came from the Vermont Historical Society. I went up there in maybe about 20 years ago and talked to Greg Sanford, who was the head historian, state historian at the time. And I was actually looking for Lynx records, and he said, oh, you know, I have something you might be interested in. He goes down these creaky steps and he brings me up this huge leather-bound book. And inside were these receipts signed by Ira Allen and Thomas Chittenden. And what happened was, when a settler shot a wolf, he took the head to the county clerk, rather gruesome. The county clerk wrote out a receipt to the state treasurer, I guess who were Ira Allen and Thomas Chittenden through this period, and they would send $20 back to the town clerk. And $20, according to Greg, at the time was maybe 3 to 6 months' salary for these farmers. So there was not only an incentive to protect their livestock, but also, I mean, a financial incentive for them. So this was something that went on through the 1700s and 1800s until eventually many of the predators were extirpated. And you can see on this map, if you look closely, there's a couple of blue dots, and those blue dots are actually mountain lions. And I'm not sure whether that shows the ratio of mountain lions to wolves at the time, or whether they just kind of got mixed in to the wolf bounty book. But we know we did have mountain lions, and of course there was a bounty on them as well throughout this whole period, and both of those large predators were gone by the late 1800s, early 1900s. Many other species also declined or were extirpated because of the clearing of those forests, primarily, and unregulated harvest. We lost many of our iconic wildlife, white-tailed deer, if you can believe that, turkeys, fisher. Otter declined. We never lost them completely. Some states did, but otter, also because they're at the top of the food chain, were really susceptible to pollution. And there was, of course, a lot of pollution throughout that period of time. And so otter populations, we know, declined as a result of pollution and as a result of a decline in loss of beaver-created habitat. So it was a really, really distressing period for wildlife. So we completely lost almost all of the species that we consider common, if not abundant, today throughout that period of time. And this is just a list of some of the things that we know either declined drastically or disappeared off the landscape. You know, there's things we're not really sure about, things like bat species. A lot of the invertebrates, we really don't know, you know, what happened to those and what happened to those populations. A lot of the herps, things like amphibians and reptiles, we didn't monitor all that closely, so we're not really sure either. But we know that we lost a lot of species, and a lot of natural communities were impacted as well. Many of the farms, as most of you know, the land use history, many of those farms were abandoned beginning in the late 1800s after the Civil War, when many of the folks that went to fight in other areas realized that Vermont was not the easiest place to eke out a living, and that there was probably better soils and better climates in other parts of the country. And the Industrial Revolution and the arrival of transportation via trains, railroads that allowed people out in Ohio to ship sheep fairly cheaply to the East Coast and compete with the Vermont sheep industry. So we started to see this decline that occurred, and allowing the forest to start to recover. And so as we saw this regeneration occurring, we started to see many of the prey species that are associated with early successional types habitats, those dense understory habitats that things like rabbits and snowshoe hares need for good cover and food. White-tailed deer also are associated with those early successional types of habitats. So we started to see a boom of prey species. And also at that same time in the late 1800s, the legislature realized that many of our rivers and streams had been impacted by sedimentation. Many of our wildlife species had disappeared. And so they established a fish commission initially that was actually the precursor to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, who I work for. And they started to work towards protecting both fish habitat and wildlife habitat. And then in 1937, based primarily on work by people like Aldo Leopold and Teddy Roosevelt, Congress passed the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, which put a tax on ammunition and firearms, which was used for conservation efforts around the country. And then Earth Day even broadened that need beyond sort of species that were considered game species. So in 1921, one of the first species, well, actually, you know, deer were reintroduced in the late 1800s, but beaver were reintroduced in 1921. They were protected in 1910, brought in from New York and Maine, and there was a live trap and transfer program in 1921 to 1937. If you look at this graph, and this is what I was talking about, it looks very similar to that schematic I showed you. There were some surveys done, and in 1941, 400 beaver were found in all counties around the state. They resurveyed in 1944, 1,100 beaver showed up in that survey. So we're talking 3 years later. In 1949, so 8 years from the original survey, they were up to 8,000 beaver. Along with the increase in beaver, the increase in complaints from the public occurred. And so in 1950, a 15-day trapping season was established, and they harvested about 1,100 beaver. Part of the reason for this, and you recall I said that Native Americans utilized beaver pretty heavily, as wolves were another important predator. And by this period of time, Native Americans were not obviously harvesting the way they had been. Many were no longer living in Vermont, and we had extirpated wolves. So both of the main predators of beaver had actually disappeared by the 1920s. When we saw that increase in beaver, we saw a resurgence of our otter population, again, because they're so tied to those beaver-created wetlands. And then there were additional recovery efforts. Like I said, deer were reintroduced in the late 1800s by the precursor to a hunting and fishing association. And in the 1950s and 60s, I usually ask this question, most of you probably know, fisher were reintroduced by the Forest and Parks Department because they were a predator of porcupines. And a lot of money had been spent in trying to control porcupine populations throughout this period. And finally, the Commissioner of Forests and Parks said, why don't we just bring back the natural predator, which they did in cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Department. And as most of you know, they're doing quite well today. Turkeys were reintroduced in 1968. Geese were pinioned in 1956 in Addison so that they would come back and re-nest at Dead Creek. And now, you know, they're doing quite well, as most of you know. And in 1989, 90, and 91, we brought back the American marten, reintroduced animals from Maine and New York into the Southern Green Mountains. And we have been doing a study over the last 4 years in support and in cooperation with Central Connecticut State University and the U.S. Forest Service. And we have a small but growing, we think, population of marten in the Southern Greens, and then one other population in the Northeast Kingdom. So we're pretty excited about that. Bobcat's an interesting animal because it's one of the predators that did very well throughout this period of time. And when you think about when you have large predators that are eliminated from the landscape, your middle predators or mesocarnivores tend to increase in population. And many of you have probably followed the whole Yellowstone situation where they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone and the coyote population dropped by 50%. Well, the opposite happened here, where when we eliminated wolves and mountain lions, we saw an increase in fox and bobcat population through the early and mid 1900s. And most of that's because you have less competition, more food available, and an increase in reproduction and survival because of that. Bobcats are at the upper edge of their upper limit of their range, so they don't do well when snow depths get over 8 to 10 inches. And so they actually concentrate in deer wintering areas, very similar to deer in the wintertime. And so deer are actually an important food source for bobcat in the winter, which surprises a lot of people, but they are quite capable of harvesting a deer, particularly when the snow is deep. And this was a pretty easy way for them to make a living through the winter. They would kill a deer and cache it, cover it with snow, go, you know, a mile or two, kill another deer. I've had houndsmen tell me about following a bobcat track and finding like 4 or 5 dead deer that were cached. And once the bobcat's done that, they can live the rest of the winter off those dead deer. And this is just an example. We got a call, this is a long time ago. It was right before Thanksgiving, where I got a call from a landowner in Townsend, I think it was. And he said, there had been some mountain lion sightings. And he said, you know, I found this dead deer covered with leaves. I don't know if you guys can see it, and if you can see my pointer, but there's its head. And he said, do you think it could be that mountain lion that killed it? And this was before these cameras were really common, but you can see the camera right on the tree there. And I said, boy, I wish we had one of those new infrared cameras. And he said, I have one. He said, I'll go home. He was a Massachusetts resident. He said, I'll go home and get it, and I'll bring it back over Thanksgiving. And he posted it, and for 2 weeks, he got pictures of this bobcat coming back, feeding off uncovering the deer, feeding off of it, and then coming back and covering it back up. And after about 2 weeks, a fisher showed up, and the bobcat disappeared, and he had about a week of pictures of Fisher, and that was the end of it. But that's how bobcats would utilize their meat, their food. I'm sorry. It's never really usually this busy here. But something happened, and I'll ask this question of folks. Something happened that shook the bobcat's world. Anybody want to take a guess as to what it was? This was around the 40s or 50s.
Give him a second to type something in.
Yeah.
No guess is wrong. Might not be right, but it's not wrong. Oh, a couple of all meow, says Heather. Betsy says hunted. Dancy says coyote. David says coyotes. So there's a few answers there. Tell us what you think now.
Okay, well, that's great. Yep, it's actually was the coyote. And coyotes are not native to Vermont. They were not here prior to European settlement that we know of. And we started to see these strange animals show up in Vermont, and the map on the lower left shows where we first started to see them in the Champlain Valley and up in the northwestern part of the state. And this is your typical coyote. It's, you know, usually gray in color, although they range from blonde to reddish to almost like a German Shepherd type looking animal. But this is what the eastern coyote looks like. Prior to European settlement, they were restricted to west of the Mississippi on the plains, pretty, you know, animals that they didn't really congregate together very much. But then as the European settlers went west and cleared the forest and extirpated the wolf, the eastern coyote, which is incredibly adaptable, went east, taking whatever means that they could. In this case, the animal took the train. And they would go, they came into the northeastern part of the state through, in our case, through Canada. You can see here, this is the route that the coyotes that came into New York and Vermont took through Canada. And as they came, they bred with wolves in northern Canada. So the animal that's in Vermont is a larger animal than what originally existed west of the Mississippi. You can also see there was another route that they came east, which was sort of through the Midwest and into Ohio and Pennsylvania this way. So years ago, we provided samples to Dr. Roland Kays, who did some genetics analysis on our coyotes, and all the coyotes, you can see the dots show where they all came from. And you can see the coyote genetic makeup in the West is very diverse, and all coyote. As you move east, the genetics become way less diverse, and this red part of the pie chart is wolf genes. So our coyotes are much less genetically diverse because our coyote population is based on a very small number of animals that made it across the St. Lawrence and into Vermont. And they're larger because they bred with wolves, and they tend to be much more social and exist in family groups, unlike the Western coyote, because I think of those wolf genetics. So they're kind of a little bit of a different animal than what existed west of the Mississippi. And they're very, very adaptable, more adaptable than wolves, because they eat just about anything. You can see this was a food habit study that was done in the late 1980s. You can see that deer is an important food source in the spring, the blue bar, well, actually through all years, all seasons of the year. But most important in the spring, probably those are dead deer from the winter, but also possibly fawns. Woodchucks also really important, spring, summer, and fall, the red bar. But most important are small mammals. Anything from rabbits to mice to squirrels, any small mammal is an important food source for coyotes. Vegetation also, they're a little bit they eat they're omnivores. They eat things like cherries, raspberries, apples, all valuable to coyotes, as well as insects. And in this case, this was done in the Champlain Valley, so they were feeding on dead cows that had been thrown into the back 40 by the farmers at the time.
Kim, I've got a question from Tim.
Yeah.
He wants to know if the coyotes cross the St. Lawrence over rapids, or they're just great swimmers.
No, actually, I'm glad he asked that, actually, because back then, the St. Lawrence would freeze once in a while. And I think they probably crossed on frozen ground. Today, it hardly freezes, partially because of the warming climate, and also I think because of the shipping traffic. So it's much more of a gauntlet for animals like wolves or lynx to cross the St. Lawrence than I think it was in the 1940s. But in the 1940s, we suspect it was still a challenge, and that's why we think only maybe 3 to 5 females got across the St. Lawrence. Our population's based on a very small number of females that made it across. So it wasn't like, 100 animals got across that barrier. And coyotes, like a lot of other species, their reproductive rates go up when there's a lot of good habitat available. So when they first got here, they had very high reproductive rates because there was no competition, lots of great available habitat, lots of prey species. And so we saw a very quick expansion of the population across Vermont and across the whole Northeast, and down actually into Manhattan now and further south. And this was a study done by Dr. Dave Person. This was his master's study. He did a study, he collared coyotes to get some home range information. And from this, he found that coyote home ranges, they have larger home ranges, but they have defensible areas of about 4 to 8 square miles that they defend from other family groups. So there's a limited number of coyotes that can actually occupy Vermont because they are territorial. At the same time, once in a while they would capture a fox. They used foothold traps for this study, and they would live capture a fox. And the fox would be dead when they got there. It would have been killed by coyotes. And so his technician actually decided to do a fox study at the same time. And so they would catch foxes and collar foxes as well, red foxes in particular. And what she found was that the red foxes actually were kicked out of these habitats and would establish home ranges in the areas where coyotes were not really existing. And so just like what happened in Yellowstone, when coyotes came into Vermont, the fox population actually declined because of the competition.
One other question
Yeah.
about coyotes. They want to know, are they a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck? And how are new genes introduced today? Coyotes from other regions or dogs, or do they just sort of have a standard genetic makeup?
Right. Yeah. So there are coyotes that route through Ohio and Pennsylvania, and that group of they're not as genetically modified because they didn't go through Canada. They are starting to mix up in New York. Those animals are starting to mix with Vermont. I don't know whether they've made it into Vermont yet. I think our population is not very genetically diverse, but it doesn't seem to hamper their ability to reproduce and or succeed, because they're doing quite well here. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot we don't know about the genetics, and that genetics work was done probably 15 or 20 years ago. It'd be interesting to repeat it and see if there are some animals that have become more genetically diverse than what we found back then. Good questions, though. This is a fox that many people don't realize. It's a gray fox, and it can climb trees, and it doesn't seem to compete with, or coyotes don't seem to compete with gray foxes like they do with red foxes, and we don't know really why. We suspect it might be because they're capable of climbing trees, and they can climb pretty high. They have semi-retractile claws, very similar to a cat. So today, when a bobcat kills a deer, you can imagine what happens. And normally I would ask you, but I'm not. I'll just show you. It gets eaten by many other predators. So the fisher population has increased since the bobcat was doing so well. The coyote population has increased, and so today, an animal dies in the woods, a deer or some other prey. And immediately, there are many other predators that come to pick the bones clean, including ravens and turkey vultures. So a bobcat can no longer really live off a deer carcass. And because of that, through the 70s and 80s and 90s, we saw a decline in the bobcat harvest in Vermont. And just so you know, bobcats were bountied until 1971, if you can believe that. And then in the mid 70s, the hunting and trapping season were set for bobcats that restricted harvest. But we still were seeing a decline in that harvest, which was concerning. However, since about 2000 or 2005, we've seen a dramatic increase in the harvest, because bobcats have actually sort of reconfigured where their home ranges are, and they're doing really well in the valleys and are doing less well in the mountains, just because they just can't compete as well in the mountains with the snow conditions and the fact that coyotes are competing for the prey base. So this is a schematic of what we think has happened with bobcat populations. Probably prior to European settlement, they were lower than they are today, given the fact that Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the climate down there was similar to what it is in Quebec, Canada today. So bobcats probably did not do very well in the 16 and 1700s in Vermont and northern climates. But then as wolves and mountain lions were extirpated, we cleared the land. We saw an increase in our deer population through the early 1900s. We saw, an increase in other prey species as well. So the red line suggests that our bobcat population increased drastically through that period. We know this because even with a bounty on bobcats, we had many years where 200 to 500 bobcat were taken as a result of that bounty through the 40s and 50s with no apparent impact on the population. Then coyotes came in, fisher were reintroduced, the forest grew up, limiting the prey species, and we saw a decline in the bobcat population. And today I would draw that red line kind of going up again as bobcats have sort of figured out how to live on the landscape, that we have today. Also, the reintroduction of turkeys have provided another prey source for bobcats, which I think have really helped them to bounce back.
Great.
We did a
Can I jump back
study
to
on,
coyotes? Oh, sorry.
huh?
Can I
Go
jump
ahead.
back to a quick coyote question?
Yeah, sure.
Victoria wants to know, what is the interface now for coyotes and foxes? Because they feel like they have both existing in the same territory. So they're just sort of wondering how that works. Because when you
Yeah,
looked at the map, you know, you showed them in between. So just
right,
curious.
right. Yeah, and there may be some overlap in the territories, especially the wider territories, and also sometimes they just use the territories at different times of the day, because we do know that coyotes will kill foxes if they have the opportunity. So the fox is risking its life if it spends too much time within that core habitat of the coyote, and at the same time that the coyote exists there. So it
So like
probably
on the fringes.
they're on the fringes, and they usually spend time if they're in the same habitat, it's usually at a different time of day or night.
Okay, one other quick question. Heather notes that Vermont did an amazing job at reforestation. She wants to know how that happened. Was it part of the Conservation Corps? How were we reforested?
Well, I mean, we lucked out, actually, and I've had other people say that. I mean, I'd like to think it was the way we planned things, but I think we never went through the Industrial Revolution in Vermont, so we never had, you know, the huge clearing of forests once they started to recover. And so our forests, luckily, are resilient, and they were allowed to grow back, and our job now is to try to maintain them and keep them for the future. And that's going to take, I think, some more thoughtful planning to make sure that that happens. I think we just lucked out historically. But great, I really appreciate the questions. I'm going to go pretty quickly so we can finish this up in an hour, but feel free to keep asking. So we did actually a bobcat radio collar study. We captured 39 cats. This was about maybe 15 years ago. We actually only got 14 collars back for a variety of different reasons, which I won't go into right now. But we were looking at critical habitats and how to make sure that we could protect bobcat habitat. And this is just one example of what we found. This is one cat in the Champlain Valley, and it shows you how it uses habitat. And you can see these dots are just the movements of that cat, and how it doesn't use the open fields, didn't use development very much. When it had to cross an open field, it used these hedgerows. And so we got a lot of really great information about important habitats for bobcats, how they cross roads, how they use riparian areas. So this was really a helpful study for us. Many of the species that we have in Vermont today are actually more abundant than they were 200 years ago. So the species listed here, some of them have even become what people perceive to be problems, although I don't like to call any wildlife problems. Most of the problems we have are our problems. But you can see if you had a dumpster with this many raccoons in it, you might consider that a problem. And raccoons and opossums, skunks, they all do really well around humans. Red fox and coyotes are also pretty adaptable. And, you know, we hear a lot from people with concerns about fissure and you know, predation on pets, in particular cats. Some of our biggest issues today are how we allow people and wildlife to live together, and how do we solve problems for people who have wildlife in their backyards, because we want people to value these species, and we find that they do until the animal is, you know, flooding their driveway, or the bear's on the back porch, or the moose is touching noses with your kitten. Those become a little bit concerning, and so trying to figure out how to solve those problems for people so they continue to value these animals is really a critical role for us. Again, you know, this is a situation with beaver flooding. This is really common for us now. When you think about Vermont has 64,000 culverts at least, and I think 14,000 miles of state highway. A lot of these were put in, this infrastructure was put in prior to beaver being back on the landscape. So now that they've been reintroduced, you can imagine that there is lots of conflicts between our town and state highways and beaver flooding. And so we have a beaver baffle program where we install water control structures to try to allow people to live in harmony with beaver so that we can lower the water level, maintain the wetland, and still maintain the human infrastructure and the beaver. But keep in mind that, you know, the main predators of beaver are gone, and the only people left are, the only predators left are humans to actually control this population to some degree. And sometimes that needs to be part of the equation. I think the biggest threat to wildlife is no longer, you know, they're heavily, any kind of hunting or trapping is heavily regulated. What we really have to do is like it was mentioned before, protect the habitat. And the biggest threat is loss and conversion of that habitat to something other than what's beneficial for particularly our wide-ranging animals like lynx and marten and fisher and bobcat. And so trying to figure out how to do that and still allow development in the state and people to live in the state it's a real challenge. I would say probably the biggest challenge we face ahead, along with climate change. So habitat is the key, and I'll take any more questions that people have.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Kim.
Sure.
One question that's in the chat box is from Tim, and he'd love to know a couple of books or resources that you might recommend if for additional info on the types of topics that you shared. I'm sure you'll mention water, because I know that's your favorite.
Yeah, water is a good one. Hands on the Land by Jan Albers. If you read these, you'll see where I get a lot of this stuff. Jan Albers wrote the book, Hands on the Land. Want me to run and get it and show folks?
If you want. I'm typing in the chat box too.
Okay, hang on. I'll just get it so I can.
I'm typing in a few of the titles in the chat box for those of you that want to write them down.
It's called Hands on the Land, History of the Vermont Landscape by Jan Albers. It's a great book, and I forget, it was written I think it was in cooperation with the Orton Family Foundation. It's getting dated now. It was probably written in the late 90s, but it's still a really interesting history. I mean, I'm not a historian, so there may be some scholarly historical documents that might be also good, but this is a really interesting just history of Vermont.
Awesome. Here's another interesting one. Emily wants to know, how does the pandemic change how wildlife and forests are expected to be treated by campers, or what things might we have noticed, or have you been noticing, or what are biologists predicting?
Yeah, well, you know, there's lots of things we could say about that. I think the first thing is that I think most of you have been seeing, even on the news, how as humans have been sequestered, wildlife have been sort of moving into human habitats. And I think you and Lisa, you and I were just talking about the numbers of bear sightings and conflicts that are being reported, partly because people are home and they're noticing these things way more often. But in terms of how this pandemic might affect the future, again, Lisa and I were sort of talking about this. I think I'm hopeful that we all recognize how important nature is to us. I think that those of us in Vermont have been lucky to be able to spend this time going outside and connecting to nature. Not that we haven't always done that, but this has just provided us more time, and the fact that a lot of the other diversions have been eliminated. It's been a time when we really realize what's important to us, and I think nature and getting outside is one of those things that has really risen to the top for a lot of people. And I'm hoping that that we all remember how important these things are to all of us, and that we can then work towards maintaining what we value for our kids and our grandkids. Maybe that's dreaming, but that's my hope.
I think that's a great place to kind of end things here. There's a few thank yous in the uh, chat box. A reminder for people to bring in their feeders with bears. They did want to know about the hummingbird feeders. Can those stay out?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, unless you have problems, I don't know. I think they can stay out. I haven't heard that. Have you, Lisa?
Not so much with the hummingbird feeders. No, it's more
Yeah.
of the seed and the attraction
Right.
for that.
Yeah. I mean, if you start to have issues, then bring them in. But I don't think that's been a problem normally.
All righty. Well, thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kim, so much for being with us and sharing this presentation. We have Coffee with a County Forester coming up on Friday, and a number of other programs. Check out our Google Calendar from our website, vermontcoverts.org. You can also make a donation online and sign up for our e-news so you can be alerted to other programs that we have available. We'll continue with these online programs as long as we have the stay home, stay safe. I know they're starting to open things up, but many of us still need to shelter at home. So we hope to bring you more of this and help you enjoy your time outdoors by understanding more of the history as we move forward into the future. Thanks so much.
Yeah. It was great. I wish I could see you all in person, but it was at least great to interact. So thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for allowing me to do that.
Thank you, Kim. Bye-bye, all.